Hello and welcome to episode 29 of the Insider's Guide to Project Cars 2, where today we are going to be taking a look at driving front-wheel drive cars, how to drive them effectively and control that lift-off oversteer, the main handling characteristic of front-wheel drive cars, and basically how to be smooth and extract the most amount of speed possible and to get the fastest lap times. Now, we are going to be driving the Renault Clio Cup Car, mainly because A, it's probably my favourite car in the game, but also B, it's a fantastic car for learning good car control, and where it is a front-wheel drive car, obviously it's very well suited for this episode, but it has a lot of lift-off, it has quite a bit of lift-off oversteer in it, and there's not really too much horsepower to overwhelm you when coming out of the corners, and yeah, it's a great training tool for basically learning good car control. Now, we are going to be driving around the Brands Hatch GP circuit because it's got a fairly decent variation of corners, but most of them are quite high speed, which is basically going to help aid us in basically trying to learn how to be as smooth as possible and try and minimize the amount of lift-off oversteer, which is the main handling characteristic of these front-wheel drive cars. And we're also going to be driving with the loose tuning setup as well, because it helps to, again, emphasize the lift-off oversteer, but also try and teach us to be a bit more smoother. Now, we are going to come out of the pits, and obviously I've got the track IR on as well, and we are going to start off with cold tyres in this session, as you can see up in the top right there. As it is a practice session, tyres aren't preheated, and one thing to note with front-wheel drive cars is generally you aren't going to generate that much heat into the rear tyres, and generally they will tend to cool a fair bit more. Now, in a practice session like this, or on a formation lap, the best way to basically build up the heat or maintain the heat in the car is to basically do a mixture of reasonably aggressive but also controlled, obviously weaving to generate load in the tyres, but also braking and acceleration. Now, one thing that you definitely want to be doing is making sure that you are braking in a straight line when you've got cold tyres, and when you're doing the weaving that you are quite heavily on the accelerator, as what these front-wheel drive cars tend to suffer from quite heavily is lift-off oversteer. Now, this is essentially, if I come and demonstrate it, coming into this corner just down the bottom of the hill here, it's basically once you come off the throttle and start decelerating, all the weight goes to the front of the car, and then as you turn in, the more aggressively you turn in, the rear of the car will start to rotate. So we'll demonstrate it here. You can see that we get massive oversteer from the rear of the car. Now, that was probably emphasized a lot more due to the fact that I've actually got cold tyres, so there's going to be very, very little grip on those tyres. But even when the rear tyres are heated up and the front tyres are also heated up, you will tend to find that the front-wheel drive cars suffer from a lot of lift-off oversteer. Now, this is essentially, like I said, where you approach the corner, start decelerating, either just through lifting off or braking coming into the corner. Particularly under heavy braking, the lift-off oversteer is going to be even greater. But it comes right at the point that you start to turn in, as obviously where you've been decelerating, all the weight is going to be at the front of the car, and generally in front-wheel drive cars there's pretty much no weight over the rear wheels. The drivetrain, the gearbox, and also the engine generally tend to be situated at the front, and the front tyres are the ones that tend to do all the work with the steering, also the delivery of the power as well, because obviously it's front-wheel drive, and then the braking is shared between the front and also the rears. The rear tyres do tend to have brakes as well, but where there is that very little weight, all that weight being on the front means that generally there's not much grip on the rear, and you get a lot of oversteer once you start to rotate into the corner. Now, there are two ways of combating this lift-off oversteer. Obviously, counter-steering into the slide is going to be one way, but the other way, and probably the most effective, is actually throttle control. and this is basically done to control that weight balance of whereabouts in the car longitudinally. I think I said that right, longitudinally. That weight is actually situated. Now, getting heavier onto the throttle is going to shift more of that weight rearwards, which is going to basically help the rear tyres to maintain some of their grip whilst turning into the corner, which means that generally it'll be much smoother. You'll get less lift-off oversteer, and that is something that you'll want to be doing with these front-wheel drive cars. Generally what a lot of people tend to do is kind of use that lift-off oversteer to get the car actually into the corner, but what they forget is that a lot of front-wheel drive cars don't have all that much power, especially this Renault Clio Cup car. Some of the higher class touring cars have turbos on them, so once the turbos actually kick in, you kind of get quite a bit of grunt and torque to help accelerate you coming out of the corner. But this Renault Clio Cup car, for instance, doesn't have all that much horsepower, and it does have a small turbo, but it's not producing, like I said, a huge amount of horsepower. So it's a much more momentum based car, so with that you need to be much smoother and carry the speed into the corners a lot more. So let's start to pick up the pace now and try and basically showcase some of this lift off oversteer a little bit more, and basically start to talk about how we can control it. So you can see that as I started turning in, the rear end of the car was very light and started to over rotate. Likewise again, coming into here, the car wanted to turn in. Now in that first turn what I did was actually just pretty much purely just counter steer into the slide and used a tiny bit of throttle. With that second slower turn, what I did there was actually use more of the throttle to counteract that lift off oversteer. And likewise again, coming into here, we'll probably need to use a combination of the two, but it is mainly the throttle that you are going to use in order to basically reduce the effect of the lift-off oversteer. Now you want some lift-off oversteer going into the corners, because generally front-wheel drive cars tend to understeer a lot, especially on power when they've got more horsepower as well. They'll tend to understeer a lot coming out of corners with the power on understeer. So you want to get the car basically tucked into the corner, and you can use that lift-off oversteer to actually help the car rotate in. Now once you've got the amount of rotation that you actually want, that's when you want to basically try and unwind the steering angle, or basically counter steer into the slide if necessary, but also get back on the throttle as well. The sooner you get back on the throttle and the heavier you get back on the throttle, the less lift-off oversteer that you're going to have, and it also means the more understeer that you're going to have. So you need to balance it a little bit, especially in the higher horsepower cars, like I said, where the turbos kick in and there's a lot of power going through the front tyres, and the front tyres can only do so much at once with turning, grip, and also accelerating and trying to translate the power from the engine to the tarmac. There's only so much grip that it can have, there's only so much that they can do at once, and with that you tend to get a lot of power understeer when accelerating coming out of the corners. So you want to balance the amount of throttle that you use and when you actually get on the throttle. So you can see I'm having to lift off the throttle a little bit there once I've got the car settled, to basically help to try and get the car back in more towards the apex and actually make sure that I make the corner. Now coming into this fast corner here, we are basically just going to brake slightly and then balance the throttle, and you can see we are very nice and smooth, and I've carried the speed and momentum through. Same again through this right hander here, a little bit of counter steer, but mainly using the throttle and balancing it to control that lift off oversteer. And same again here as well. And then through that right hander. Now one of the things that you probably noticed or probably heard going through those corners, which is very different to how you would drive a rear wheel driven car, is you actually get on the throttle before you make the apex. Now obviously this is very important in low horsepower cars like this, where it's more momentum based, but also it helps to control that lift-off oversteer as well. Obviously with rear-wheel drive cars, you actually don't get on the throttle until you actually make the apex, and obviously make sure that you are fairly smooth in the application of the throttle in order to basically minimize the amount of wheel spin and the power oversteer that you get. With this, it's balancing the weight distribution longitudinally in the car, and then obviously basically controlling that lift-off oversteer. So coming into these high-speed corners again, where it's obviously very, very important to be smooth and maintain that momentum, a little bit of brake way before we're into the apex, getting back onto the throttle, balancing it a little bit to the point that I know that I've got the car basically going through the radius of the corner that I wanted, and then I can get more heavily onto the throttle, and if necessary I can lift off the throttle a little bit to help the car basically tuck back in to the corner as well. So this is generally how you want to be driving these front wheel drive cars, trying to be as smooth as possible and trying not to have too much lift off oversteer, because if we come into here and just shut the car in with a ton of lift off oversteer, you can see we've gone and killed a lot of our speed and momentum through that slide. Now obviously I counter steered into that slide and then obviously gave it a boot full of gas to bring the car back in check, but the less sliding from the rear of the car that you can do, the better and faster your lap times are going to be. Now you heard the revs just drop there as I locked up the tyres. This car doesn't come with ABS or traction control, it doesn't come with any assists, which is one of the reasons why it is very, very good as a kind of training tool for learning good car control. And you can see there, using a little bit of lift off oversteer to initially turn the car in, and then using the throttle to balance the car and basically try and carry that speed through. Now obviously, as I've been saying throughout the episode, with the higher horsepower front wheel drive cars, you basically apply the same techniques of using the throttle to balance the car and its weight going through the corner. But if you've been watching my throttle trace here in this episode going through the corners, you can see that I get quite heavily on the throttle, and that is because the car doesn't have too much horsepower and therefore there isn't too much power understeer. With those heavier horsepower cars with the turbos, such as those higher end touring cars, if you get on the throttle too heavily, then you'll get a lot of understeer coming out of the corner. So there is a point that you need to basically balance the throttle at to help maintain your radius through the turn and make sure that you're not running wide on the exit. You can see we're being nice and smooth, getting heavily on the brakes there for turn 2. Now coming back down the hill again, using just a tiny little bit of lift off oversteer, letting the car rotate ever so slightly coming into the turn, unwinding the wheel a little bit with a little bit of counter steer, and then using the throttle to balance the car. And this is generally how you drive front wheel drive cars. And you can see now actually up in the top right there as well that the tyre temperatures have actually come up on the rear. Obviously the inside right tyre is a little bit cooler, mainly because it doesn't really get worked all that much, and in a lot of places that inside rear tyre could actually be lifting off the ground as well coming through the corners, as there is so much weight on the front of the car and there's not all that much weight on the rear. So it is all about actually managing that lift off oversteer, trying to be as smooth as possible. Don't let it get into too much of a slide, and basically trying to maintain and carry that as much momentum through the corners as possible. And this is one of the reasons why the racing is so good. The speeds are relatively low, they're manageable, you can race very, very closely in a pack, especially when you get very, very similar, highly skilled drivers. And where the Renault Clio Cup Car is in a class of its own, there isn't any other cars racing in the same class as it. All the cars are exactly the same, they're all equal, and it is purely down to driver skill to basically determine who is the faster driver. It's not like GT3 or GT4 where various different cars have various different handling characteristics and they kind of suit different tracks slightly better than some of the other cars. The Renault Clio Cup Car racing against other Renault Clio Cup cars are going to be on equal footing throughout. So you saw there, I got on the throttle to control that lift-off oversteer, and then I had to actually back out to make sure that I wasn't going to run wide on the exit, and then got back on the power again, trying to keep that slide angle as low as possible, working the wheel a little bit of counter steer here and there, but mainly using the throttle to control that slide and carrying that speed and momentum through the corners. So hopefully this episode has been helpful to you, especially if you've been wanting to drive front wheel drive cars a little bit more and want to basically experience the fun that they can offer and provide, as these are a lot of fun and very, very rewarding to drive this Renault Clio Cup car when you get it right, and you can be very, very smooth and you get the nice quick fast lap times out of it as well. But hopefully this episode has been useful for you. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments section below. I should try and get back to you as soon as I possibly can. And if you've been enjoying the content that I've been putting up on the channel, consider subscribing to the channel. Give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. If you didn't enjoy it, give it possibly a thumbs down or leave some constructive criticism below. And obviously a share with fellow friends and also racers who may benefit from the knowledge is also highly appreciated. But other than that, thank you very much for watching, guys. I shall hopefully catch you in the next episode, but in the meantime, take care.